Welcome to Shatter.
You're reliable. He's exciting. She didn't whisper it. She didn't lower her voice. She said it with a polite smile, the kind she used at presentations, standing under warm lights at a downtown fundraising gala. Glass walls, quiet jazz, donors drifting like they owned the air. I stood half a step behind her, holding two empty champagne flutes she'd handed me without looking. She said it to a man named Grant Cole, a private developer, one of her biggest clients. The kind of man whose handshake felt like a contract and whose watch caught attention before his face did. I didn't react. I didn't clear my throat or shift my weight. I watched her laugh after she said it, light and clean, as if she'd just made a harmless joke. Grant smiled back, slow and assured, already comfortable in spaces he didn't have to ask permission to enter. Someone nearby commented on the renovation wing my museum had just reopened. I nodded, answered briefly, did what I always did in public. I stayed useful. I stayed composed. I stayed in place. My wife, Claire, was radiant that night. Sharp dress, perfect posture, every gesture calculated to look effortless. She moved easily between conversations, collecting nods, business cards, future promises. When Grant touched her elbow to guide her through the crowd, she didn't pull away. She let him steer. No one noticed me stepping back. Archivists are trained for that. We learn how to disappear without leaving a mess. Later, while donors clustered around Grant, Claire didn't return. She didn't check if I was nearby. She didn't ask where I'd gone. Her phone buzzed once on the high table beside her clutch. I saw her glance at the screen, then turn it face down. I left before the speeches started. At home, the apartment was quiet and staged, everything where it was supposed to be. Our shared calendar glowed on the tablet in the kitchen, color-coded blocks filling the next few weeks. Dinners, openings, a weekend trip she'd planned around a networking retreat. I didn't delete anything. I didn't confront her. I didn't pace or wait by the window. I opened my laptop and signed out of the shared drive we both used. Museum files stayed. Everything else went private. When Claire came in later, heels in hand, she paused when she saw the lights off. She called my name once, lightly, as if expecting an answer. I was in the other room, still, already rearranging my life without making a sound. The first confirmation didn't come from her phone or her clothes or the way she avoided my eyes the next morning. It came from someone who had no reason to lie to me. I was at the museum, moving through the climate-controlled stacks where sound dissolved into soft echoes. The past lived there quietly, cataloged and patient. That was where Daniel found me. He worked in acquisitions, a man who spoke rarely and never without intent. He mentioned Grant Cole as if it were an administrative detail, not a warning. Daniel said Grant had just secured priority access to a private archive slated for donation, an entire collection tied to one of his redevelopment projects. He said it casually, like gossip stripped of interest. Then he paused and added that Grant had pushed the paperwork through unusually fast. Personal leverage, he called it. The kind that didn't leave fingerprints. I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. Claire's world ran on acceleration. My world ran on preservation. When something moved too fast, it usually meant corners were being cut. That evening, she floated through the apartment with a brightness that felt rehearsed. She talked about upcoming pitches and potential expansions, about how everything was finally aligning. She said Grant believed in her vision. She said it the way people say destiny, like effort had nothing to do with it. I listened from the kitchen, my hands busy with nothing important. She didn't ask about my day. She didn't notice that I'd removed my name from our shared streaming accounts, or that the fridge held fewer traces of my habits. Her phone buzzed again, face down on the counter. She smiled at the vibration, not at me. Later, she mentioned an overnight site visit tied to Grant's latest project. She framed it as necessary, unavoidable, career-defining. She said she'd be unreachable. The word landed with more certainty than she intended. I nodded. I always nodded. After she went to sleep, I didn't check her messages. I didn't need proof dressed up as pain. Instead, I logged into systems she'd never touched. Financial records, access permissions, emergency contacts, the invisible infrastructure of a shared life. I began removing myself from it. Not all at once. Not dramatically. I flagged accounts for separation, changed passwords quietly, redirected mail digitally. updated my work schedule so it no longer aligned with hers. By morning, nothing looked different. The apartment was the same. The silence was the same. But the system had shifted. She was building momentum somewhere else, convinced I would stay exactly where she left me. She didn't know that the safest thing she'd ever had was already stepping out of reach, without asking for permission or leaving a note. The evidence didn't arrive all at once. It surfaced the way structural damage does, quietly, beneath layers meant to look solid. It started with a calendar change. An event she'd marked as tentative shifted to confirmed, then moved again. A lunch turned into an evening meeting. A site walk became a private dinner. Each update overwrote the last without explanation. She didn't mention it out loud. She didn't have to. The rhythm of her days no longer included me. At the museum, I spent an afternoon reviewing donor correspondence tied to Grant's projects. Not because I was looking for him, but because his name had begun appearing where it shouldn't. Invitations routed through private channels. Access requests approved before review. Patterns that suggested favors traded outside the official process. I didn't flag anything. I copied nothing. I observed. That night, Claire showered longer than usual. Steam filled the bathroom, blurring the mirror. Her phone sat on the nightstand, unlocked, screen lighting up with incoming notifications she hadn't muted. I didn't touch it. I didn't lean closer. I caught reflections instead. Names. Initials. A preview line that ended with a promise of handling everything. She came out wrapped in confidence, not a towel. She moved past me, already elsewhere, talking about how exhausted she was, how much pressure she was under, how lucky she felt to have someone who understood her ambition. I nodded again. The next day, a banking alert hit my email. A joint account threshold notification. Not alarming on its own, just enough to indicate movement. Money shifting toward a separate stream. A reimbursement marked as consulting expenses that didn't match any project I knew. I logged into our shared financial dashboard and saw the changes clearly. Small withdrawals. Strategic. The kind designed to go unnoticed by someone who trusted too easily. I closed the tab without saving screenshots. At work, Daniel mentioned Grant again, this time with a hint of caution. He said Grant's developments were attracting attention for how quickly approvals were granted. He said people were starting to ask questions quietly, the way institutions do when they sense imbalance. I listened. I cataloged. That evening, Claire didn't come home. She sent a message saying plans had changed and she'd stay near the site. The words were efficient, stripped of affection. I replied with acknowledgement, not concern. While she was gone, I moved through the apartment with precision. I removed my name from shared subscriptions, backed up personal archives, took my grandfather's watch from the drawer she used for jewelry. I didn't take clothes yet. I wasn't gone. Not visibly. When she returned the next day, tired and distracted, she kissed my cheek absent-mindedly. Her eyes scanned the room, not for me, but for confirmation that nothing had shifted. Everything still looked the same. And that was the mistake. Because by then, I wasn't collecting proof anymore. I was preparing space. The distance didn't begin with a goodbye. It began with absence that was hard to measure. I stopped syncing my schedule to hers. Meetings appeared on my calendar without color, without overlap. I started leaving earlier and returning later, not to hide, but to exist on a different rhythm. When she mentioned plans, I acknowledged them without adjusting mine. The habit of coordination dissolved quietly. Claire noticed the change the way people notice a draft in a room they don't own. She asked if I was tired, if work was overwhelming, if I needed time. Her concerns sounded procedural, not intimate. I said I was fine. At the museum, I requested a temporary shift in responsibilities tied to an upcoming private cataloging project. It justified longer hours and limited contact. My badge access expanded. My personal availability shrank. No lies were required. Just formal requests approved by people who respected boundaries. At home, I stopped restocking what I didn't use. The coffee she liked ran out. The specialty groceries she preferred stopped appearing. The apartment remained orderly, but it no longer catered to her routines. She filled the silence with calls taken in other rooms, voices lowered, laughter brief and contained. I stopped responding immediately. Messages from her sat unread just long enough to register delay. Not neglect. Delay. the kind that unsettles without accusation. One evening, she stood in the doorway while I organized documents on my tablet. She asked if everything was okay between us. She phrased it carefully, like a question meant to avoid answers. I told her nothing had changed. That was technically true. The shared cloud drive we built our life around began returning access errors on her end. She mentioned it casually, assuming a glitch. I said I'd look into it. I didn't. The joint planning folder vanished next. Then the shared notes. Then the archive of photos we both pretended to revisit. I didn't delete them. I moved them somewhere she couldn't reach. She laughed it off at first. Said technology was unreliable. Said she'd been meaning to organize things anyway. But her laughter thinned. When she realized my emergency contact had been updated at work, she didn't confront me. She searched for context, scanning my face for cues I didn't provide. I remained present, polite, unavailable. By the time she understood that my life no longer revolved around her momentum, it was already too late to ask when it had started. The disappearance wasn't dramatic. It was structural. I hadn't left the city. I hadn't packed a bag. I had simply removed myself from the places where she expected me to be and let the space speak for itself. Grant's vulnerability wasn't personal. Men like him rarely leave those exposed. It was structural, buried in the machinery that made his influence feel effortless. I noticed it through paperwork that wasn't meant to be interesting. At the museum, a private lender reached out with a routine verification request tied to one of Grant's developments. It referenced a collection promised as cultural collateral, an arrangement that allowed his projects to move faster under the guise of public value. The request wasn't urgent, just careful, the kind institutions make when something doesn't line up cleanly. I responded professionally. I clarified dates. I confirmed receipt of documents that hadn't actually arrived. I asked for standard follow-up materials, knowing they would have to come from Grant's side. Nothing accusatory. Nothing confrontational. The delay started there. Grant's approvals relied on momentum, on the assumption that no one would slow the process long enough to look closely. My questions forced pauses. Pauses forced reviews. Reviews invited scrutiny from people who didn't know him favors. At home, Claire felt the shift before she understood it. Her calls became shorter. Her movements sharper. She stopped narrating her successes and started pacing when she thought I wasn't paying attention. One evening, she mentioned that Grant was dealing with unexpected complications. She framed it as temporary friction, nothing serious. Her tone tried for confidence and missed. I acknowledged the comment and returned to my work. At the museum, Daniel mentioned that a promised donation tied to Grant's project was suddenly under reevaluation. He didn't ask me why. He didn't need to. He just observed that certain fast-track benefits had been suspended pending clarification. I kept my distance. I didn't attend meetings where Grant's name appeared on agendas. I didn't offer opinions. I let the process do what processes do when they're no longer rushed. Claire's phone rang more often. She stepped outside to take calls she used to make openly. When she returned, her composure felt rehearsed again, but the polish was cracking. She asked if I'd heard anything unusual at work. She phrased it lightly, as if curiosity were harmless. I told her no. That was true in the way that mattered. Grant's world didn't collapse. It stalled. For men like him, that's worse. Deals paused. Timelines extended. Confidence eroded quietly. The kind of pressure that doesn't announce itself, but forces people to look around for leverage that isn't responding. I didn't celebrate. I didn't feel vindicated. I simply stayed out of reach, watching structures adjust to the absence of the shortcuts he was used to taking and the absence of the man Claire assumed would always remain exactly where she left him. The shift became visible to others before Claire admitted it to herself. She stopped being invited into rooms early. Not excluded, just delayed. Meetings that used to hinge on her presence began moving without her. When she arrived, conversations adjusted, voices lowering, eyes checking reactions instead of seeking approval. At one event tied to her firm's newest project, I watched it happen from a distance. I wasn't attending as her husband. I was there on institutional business, neutral, peripheral. Claire scanned the room when she entered, instinctively locating Grant. He wasn't where he usually stood. When she found him, he was already engaged, his attention divided, his posture guarded. She approached with practiced ease. He acknowledged her, but not with the same confidence. Their exchange was brief, efficient, stripped of familiarity. When she stepped away, she didn't replace herself at the center of the room. She hovered at the edges, phone in hand, waiting for someone to pull her back in. No one did. A woman she'd mentored stopped mid-sentence when Claire joined her group. The pause wasn't hostile. It was careful. Someone else excused themselves. Another smiled politely and changed the subject. The kind of social distancing that doesn't announce itself but leaves no room to stand comfortably. Later, someone mentioned that certain approvals tied to Grant's projects were under review. Not loudly, just enough for the information to circulate. The tone wasn't accusatory. It was observant. Claire's face tightened for a fraction of a second before smoothing out. She laughed lightly, as if it were irrelevant. Her eyes searched the room again, this time looking for me. I wasn't close enough to be useful. At home, she moved through the apartment with restlessness she couldn't disguise. She opened cabinets she didn't need, checked her phone repeatedly, set it down face up, then flipped it over. When she finally spoke, she didn't accuse. She asked if I'd noticed how strange people were acting lately. I told her things shift all the time. She nodded, unconvinced. Messages from her friends slowed. Invitations came with less certainty. She started narrating conversations aloud, as if rehearsing explanations no one had requested yet. I listened without engagement. By then, the absence of my participation had become noticeable. Not dramatic, just unfamiliar. I didn't step in to reassure. I didn't defend her in rooms she wasn't present in. I wasn't an extension of her credibility anymore. The silence around her grew, not because anyone attacked her, but because attention moved elsewhere. Status is loud until it isn't. And when she finally understood that the room wasn't closing in on her, but opening away from her, she realized she was standing alone in it, without the one person who used to make her presence feel anchored. Her isolation didn't arrive as silence. It arrived as noise that no longer connected to anything. She took more calls than before, pacing near windows, lowering her voice, repeating the same assurances to different people. I heard her say things were under control, that adjustments were being made. That timing was the issue, not credibility. Each call ended the same way, with a pause she tried to hide before setting the phone down. She began asking where I was more often, not because she needed me, but because she needed something familiar to still be where she expected it. I answered without detail. I was busy. I had work. I had commitments. All true. None of them included her. At the museum, my days filled cleanly. Projects progressed without urgency. I stayed late when it suited me and left early when it didn't. My life regained a shape that didn't bend around anyone else's momentum. The calm wasn't performative. It was functional. Claire noticed that I no longer adjusted my plans when hers shifted. When she suggested dinner, I checked my schedule and declined without apology. When she mentioned a weekend event, I said I'd already arranged something else. I didn't explain. I didn't soften it. She started waiting for me in the evenings, sitting on the couch with the lights dimmed, as if the setting itself might prompt closeness. When I passed through the room, she watched me with an attention that bordered on disbelief. I was there, but not available. Her world continued tightening. Grant's name stopped appearing in her conversations altogether, not because he was gone, but because whatever remained between them no longer elevated her. She stopped dressing for events she wasn't sure would matter. Her confidence lost its rhythm. One afternoon, she stood in the kitchen and asked if I thought people could misjudge situations when they moved too fast. The question floated between us, heavy with implication. I answered by continuing what I was doing. That night, she sat closer than usual, her posture angled toward me, searching for a signal. I gave her none. The distance wasn't physical. It was absolute. She began reaching out to friends she hadn't needed before. The responses came slower. Polite. Non-committal. Support without enthusiasm. She tried to laugh it off, but the effort showed. I watched her adapt in real time, adjusting expressions, revising narratives, attempting to stabilize something that no longer responded to pressure. The more she tried to regain footing, the clearer it became that the ground had shifted permanently. I didn't intervene. I didn't offer guidance. I remained exactly where I was, calm and unreachable, while the version of me she relied on continued to exist only in her memory. The confrontation didn't happen the way she expected. There was no raised voice, no dramatic reveal, no demand for explanations. She waited for a crack in my routine that never came, then finally stepped into the space I'd stopped offering. She approached me one evening while I was reviewing documents, her movements careful, as if sudden motion might break whatever fragile balance remained. She stood too close, close enough that I could feel the question before she found a way to shape it. She said she felt distance. She said she didn't understand when it started. She said she wanted to know if I was still here. I looked at her, not searching, not defensive, just present. I didn't deny the distance. I didn't confirm it either. I closed my tablet and set it aside, giving her my full attention for the first time in days. That alone seemed to unsettle her more than silence had. She tried again, this time slower. She mentioned stress, pressure, how things had spiraled unexpectedly. She spoke as if events had acted on her, not through her. As if proximity to power had been whether she'd been caught in, not chosen. I listened without interrupting. When she finished, she waited. Her expression held the expectation of reassurance, of grounding, of the familiar pattern where I would stabilize what she couldn't. I didn't step into that role. I told her I'd noticed the changes too. I said people sometimes confuse acceleration with direction. I said I was adjusting my life to reflect what was actually happening, not what was being presented. I didn't mention Grant. I didn't mention money or access or nights spent elsewhere. I didn't need to. The absence of accusation left her nothing to argue against. She asked if I was pulling away. I didn't answer directly. I told her I was no longer organizing my life around assumptions that no longer held. I said it calmly, without emphasis, as if explaining a policy update rather than a fracture. She searched my face for emotion she could use. There was none on display. For the first time, her confidence faltered openly. She tried to close the distance with touch, then hesitated, uncertain whether it was still allowed. I didn't move toward her. I didn't move away. That pause told her more than any confrontation could have. She stepped back, visibly recalibrating, as if realizing she'd entered a room where the rules had changed without notice. The realization didn't come with tears or anger. It came with something quieter and more dangerous to her sense of control. Uncertainty. When she left the room, she glanced back once, as if expecting me to follow or call her name. I stayed where I was. By then, I wasn't exiting the relationship. I was already outside of it, watching her discover that the version of me she needed no longer existed in a form she could reach. Her collapse didn't arrive with a single event. It arrived in fragments, spaced just far enough apart that she couldn't brace for them. The first was professional, a project she'd been attached to quietly reassigned. No announcement, no explanation. She found out through a forwarded email that didn't include her. She reread it twice, then once more, as if her name might appear if she looked long enough. She made calls that afternoon, the kind meant to reassert presence, the kind meant to remind people she was still relevant. I heard her voice from the other room, firm at first, then carefully pleasant, then clipped. Each call ended sooner than she expected. Grant didn't return her messages. Not immediately, not later. When he finally did, it was brief and transactional, stripped of warmth or implication. Whatever access she thought she'd secured had expired without notice. At home, she began misplacing things. Keys left in the wrong place. Documents half-filed. Her movements lost their usual efficiency. She stood still more often, staring at nothing, phone in hand without scrolling. One evening, she dressed as if for an event that no longer existed. When she realized there was nowhere to go, she sat on the edge of the bed and didn't move for a long time. I passed the doorway once. She didn't look up. The social invitations stopped arriving. Not dramatically, just gradually. When she reached out first, responses came late or not at all. Familiar enthusiasm had been replaced with polite distance. She tried to anchor herself to me then, not with accusations, with proximity. She lingered in shared spaces, asked practical questions she already knew the answers to, commented on small things, searching for traction. I didn't offer resistance. I didn't offer comfort. The moment she understood I wasn't going to intervene came quietly. She stood in the kitchen holding her phone, reading something that drained the color from her face. She lowered herself into a chair as if her legs no longer trusted her. I didn't ask what it was. Later, I watched her scroll through old photos on her tablet. Not the glamorous ones. The ordinary ones she'd ignored before. Me in the background. Me holding things together without being seen. Her expression shifted as recognition set in, not as a revelation, but as accumulation. Loss after loss had cleared the noise. And in that silence, she finally saw what had been steady all along, and what she'd stepped away from assuming it would never move. By then, it was too late to reach for it. The end didn't announce itself. It settled. Claire stopped trying to explain. She stopped searching my face for reactions. The urgency that once drove her movements had burned out, leaving something quieter and harder to ignore. When she spoke, it was slower, careful, as if each word had to justify its place. She tried once more, not with defense or ambition, but with honesty stripped of strategy. She said she hadn't meant for things to go the way they did. She said she'd confused momentum with meaning. She said she finally understood what she'd risked. I listened without interruption. When she finished, the silence stretched long enough for her to realize I wasn't weighing her words. I wasn't deciding anything. Whatever choice she thought she was influencing had already been made elsewhere. I told her I wasn't angry. I told her I hadn't disappeared. I said I'd simply stopped showing up in spaces where my presence was treated as guaranteed. The statement landed heavier than any accusation could have. She nodded slowly, as if the shape of it was only just becoming clear. She asked what that meant for us. The question carried no expectation anymore, only recognition that the ground beneath her had changed permanently. I told her my life was stable now, structured, quiet in the way that lasts. I said I wasn't willing to rebuild on terms that required me to become invisible again. I didn't offer ultimatums. I didn't negotiate. She understood then that this wasn't a punishment. It was a boundary that didn't need reinforcement. Over the next days, I finalized what I'd already prepared. Accounts were separated cleanly. Access adjusted. Living arrangements clarified without drama. I remained present, courteous, distant. The calm unsettled her more than anger ever could have. On my last morning in the apartment, I moved through the rooms without nostalgia. Everything I needed was already accounted for. What remained belonged to a version of us that no longer existed. Claire stood by the window, watching the city wake without her. She didn't ask me to stay. She didn't ask where I was going. She knew better. At the door, I paused long enough for her to turn. Our eyes met, not in conflict, but in finality. I told her reliability isn't something you notice until it's gone. I said safety isn't the absence of excitement, but the presence of respect. I didn't wait for a response. When I left, I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. I hadn't taken revenge. I hadn't needed closure from her. I'd simply reclaimed the part of myself I'd handed over quietly and walked away with it intact. Support the channel by liking, commenting, and subscribing. I promise even more interesting stories.